Now that we've done 10 deep dives across most of the mainline Pokemon games, I figured it's finally time we revisit Sun and Moon, the very first deep dive I ever made. If you saw that original video, you'll know just how much scrapped content Sun and Moon had. Content that hadn't really been talked about much before, so the purpose of this sequel is to dive even deeper into the games, covering details I missed the first time, as well as cover new discoveries and insights I've come across since then. So with that said, let's jump right in, starting with a look at some of the early presentations and documents related to the development of Sun and Moon. Let's begin with a project pitch, a document that essentially laid out the initial concept for Sun and Moon. Before we dive into it, I want to clarify that as far as I know, there's only one slide from the project pitch. And after doing extensive research, this is the earliest piece of anything related to the Sun and Moon project that I could find, and it's the only piece from this date. That places the pitch just a couple months after the release of X and Y, and during development of ORS, with a total development cycle of just under 3 years, from pitch to release. One particularly interesting detail in this pitch is the section labeled Target Machine. Instead of listing the 3DS, it actually says to be decided. That small line alone holds incredible weight. You see, at the time, the Nintendo Switch was already in development. Nintendo, as we know, was coming off a commercial fail of a Wii U, desperately scrambling to save their own company and get their next console out as soon as possible. Given the scenario, it's entirely possible that Sun and Moon were being considered as early Switch titles, maybe even as launch games. If this theory is correct, it also suggests that Nintendo originally aimed to release the Switch in October 2016, about 5 months earlier than when it actually launched, meaning the release of the Switch itself was delayed, a fact that I don't think has ever been revealed to the public. This also means that Sun and Moon were intended to release in October of 2016, but ended up releasing a month later in November instead. Now, despite considerations, I get why Sun and Moon never released on the Switch, but I always found it strange that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon didn't make the leap to Switch. I remember at the time there were tons of rumors about a port or a new version dubbed Pokemon Stars for the Switch, yet it never actually happened, and the Ultra game stayed on the 3DS. And there's so many factors that could have impacted this decision, like the production of the Let's Go games commencing as soon as Pokemon Go blew up, pushing Game Freak's Switch team to work on Let's Go, and maybe shifting priorities away from a Sun and Moon port. I also came across a solo presentation that internally revealed the names Pokemon Sun and Moon to Game Freak staff. According to this document, the names were finalized on February 2nd, 2015. About a year after the original pitch, and roughly a year and a half before release. The slide even includes some insight into the reasoning and philosophy behind the names, which I'll leave on screen for you to read if you're interested. Shortly after that, on February 12, 2015, Game Freak put together a full presentation outlining the scenario and setting direction for the project. And there are some really interesting details here, like this one slide in particular that lays out Game Freak's early structure of the game. It confirms that Game Freak wanted there to be much more freedom than it did in the final game, and the team were aiming to include 2 gameplay paths, an easy to play linear scenario and a freedom of open world non-linear scenario. The goal was to keep the destination clear, but allow multiple ways to get there, depending on how each player wanted to experience the story. To support players who might feel lost with all of that freedom, there would have been a dedicated UI system to help guide them back on track. I wouldn't be surprised if this is how the Rotom Dex concept was born, and ultimately the game would conclude when the player became champion. I would assume with this original vision, you'd be able to travel between the islands and tackle the trials as you want. Maybe leveled scaling was involved here. We know Mantine surfing was introduced in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and that the Ultra games did include some of the scrapped concepts from the original game, so maybe the ability to surf between islands was a scrapped feature from a base Sun and Moon. And when you think about Gen 10, and the rumors of an open world island hopping region, the idea becomes even more compelling. It makes you wonder if this has always been a dream concept at Game Freak, something they tried for the 20th anniversary, and may finally be able to pull off for the 30th. Another slide talks about the representation of a living world. According to Game Freak, the goal here was to build a world based on ecosystems and the distribution of Pokemon. They specifically mention wanting to create a significant number of Pokemon-focused events, the idea being that these would form experiences that were truly unique to Pokemon. Now, I can definitely see traces of this in how the taboos tie into Alolan culture, or how specific Pokemon are more tied to the region and the lore, but the more I thought about it, the more I started remembering the Sun and Moon demo. You see, in the demo, there were these weekly sub-quests, featuring different Pokemon and NPCs, and sure, they were very simple, but they felt so alive, like actual side stories. And honestly, now that I think about it, Story-based side quests are one of the biggest things missing from most Pokemon games. You see them all the time in other JRPGs, and it's such a central part of the gameplay. Yet it's something that's almost completely absent in Pokemon. So maybe that was the vision here. Maybe these Pokemon events were meant to be full sub-stories, layered throughout the world. We got a taste of it in the demo, but nothing really like it made it into the final game. Also interesting, it says that the legendary Pokemon would have the ability to make it day or make it night, and says that there were going to be specific events that could only happen during the day or night. This was probably before we landed on the whole 12-hour time difference between Sun and Moon, but still, if I remember correctly, the events that happened during the day or night was very limited. The next slide in the presentation goes even deeper into this sub-scenario system. The graphic on the right hand side sums it up quite nicely. You could do the sub-quests at any point during the main scenario and then continue on with the main quest. And this would still be the case after you entered the Hall of Fame. The text on the left confirms that Game Freak wanted around 200 to 300 of these small to medium-sized events, allowing players to expand the world they experience at their own discretion. This is honestly one of the biggest breakthroughs in scrapped content for Sun and Moon we've ever seen. Don't get me wrong, I love Alola as it is. It's one of my favorite regions, and I love how it handled the culture of Alola and made it feel important. But just imagine if we got this system, 200 plus mini-stories, organically tied to Pokemon and the region itself. It wouldn't even be a debate. Alola would instantly become the best region in the series, and there would be no comparison. If you guys remember from part 1, there was a planned DLC for Sun and Moon, which goes hand in hand with this revelation as it reveals there would have been added quests. To me, the scale of this idea is still kind of mind-blowing. There's so much potential here, especially because Pokemon isn't just about battling, it's about the world, the people, the bonds between trainers and partners, and something like this would easily take Pokemon to a whole new level. The next slide gives us our first real look at some beta gameplay. Honestly, it doesn't look as rough as I'd expect, considering this was developed sometime before February 2015. Also, I can't recognize the surrounding area. We also get a good look at the beta Alola region map. Okay, first of all, the slide outlines 4 islands. There's still a graphic showing the 5th island, but no details drawn upon it. Focusing in on Melee Island, there's some major layout differences. First, the path to the left of a player's house is completely missing in the beta map. The beach nearby extends much further north, but in turn the final game has this small area that you can explore on the sea level, unless the plan in the beta was that you could surf anywhere. Despite cutting the added details in the final version, it seems like they found a way to expand the island with the extra paths you could travel. Another notable detail, it appears there's supposed to be a road that stretched all the way around the island. In the final game, the road ends at the player's house and again at the north of Hau'oli City. If anyone watching this is from Hawaii, let me know in the comments. Do roads wrap around the island like this? I'd love to know if that was a design inspiration. Hau'oli City had some notable differences too. The beach actually connected to 10 Carat Hill, whereas in the final game they're separate. A couple enterable buildings near the beach were also cut. The marina was also right next to the beach. I much prefer its location in the final game. Another major difference is that a diagonal road used to run through Hau'oli City. This was instead converted into those gate paths filled with tall grass. I have to admit that was a pretty clever redesign. It made space while also giving Hau'oli more variety. Also, something really important to note here, both the beta maps and final maps are presented from the same camera angle. Neither one is tilted or distorted, so any size differences or proportion differences you see are exactly as shown. That means that the north of the island originally extended out much further. Hau'oli City stretched out towards the northwest. In general, it seems like there was a lot more going on in this area. More buildings, more stuff, most of which was scaled back. There was also this huge path that stretched along the middle of the island, which clearly could not fit in the final game, meaning the size of the island was scaled down too. And here's Akala Island. Honestly, I could go on all day about all the small changes here, so I'll just let you guys get a good look at the maps side by side. The biggest difference I could notice is of course the road stretching around the island and this huge isolated island. I wonder if this was originally where Lana's trial was held, before being moved all the way up here. Makes me wonder what this area was originally for. In general, the beta version of Akala gives off some heavy park vibes. Very open, very green, and path-led. The final game is way more dense in comparison. Also worth pointing out, the area where the golf course sits in the final game is marked as a hotspot on the beta map, as we know that was an unused location in the final game. Next we have Ula Ula Island. Despite not having a road wrapped around the island, the final version of Ula Ula is pretty close to the concept. The design remained relatively close. The only big difference I could note is the much more expanded Melee City. You can see the general final layout, and even the garden is still present, but there's this massive urban area that's completely gone in the final game. It probably wouldn't have even fit within the map scale of a released version. So again, we're seeing that the island was scaled down significantly. Looks like there was a lot more going around Po Town too. Also, the final version has this explorable surfing area towards the southwest. Besides that, the main differences here are layout and route adjustments. And finally, we've got Pony Island. Out of all the islands, this one stayed the closest to its original vision. The Seafolk village is mapped out exactly as it appears in the final game. It is a small island after all, so it's not surprising that this stayed closest to the concept. And just as a reminder, this map was presented in February 2015, just around a year and a half before Sun and Moon actually released. Unlike the development of Scarlet and Violet, it goes to show just how much would change with a region's design during this era, in such a short period of time. Here I'm flipping through the design philosophy slides for each island. Feel free to pause and read through them as you like. There's some really cool insights. What really caught my attention is this list at the end, which outlines the original plans for the post-game. First off, we've got Team Rainbow Rocket, which was completely scrapped from the base games and then revived for the Ultra games. Then there's Perfect Zygoid, which did make it into the final version, but then there's Create a Pokemon Gym. We touched on the scrapped concept entirely in part 1. This feature didn't make it into the base or the Ultra games, but the fact it's listed this high up tells me they were seriously considering it as a core part of a post-game. In fact, many of you might remember the unused plots of land scattered around Alola. At the time, it was heavily rumored to be future gym locations. Similar to the Rainbow Rocket story, what if Create a Gym was another feature they saved for the Ultra games, but for whatever reason, they just couldn't pull it off. Next, it says that the battle facilities would be unlocked. That could be referring to the battle tree, which did appear in the base game, but it also could be referring to the battle cruise concept we covered in part 1, where you travel around the world battling past trainers. That could very well have evolved into the battle tree over the course of development. It also listed Defeat the Rainbow Beast as one of the plans. I have no clue what this could mean, possibly alluding to Ultra Necrozma. Then it mentions legendary Pokemon related events, which may have evolved into the Ultra Warp Ride, and the returning legendaries in the Ultra games. And finally, there's something called girl related events. No clue what that could mean. All of this really makes me wonder, if this was the plan for the base Sun and Moon, then what were the original ideas for the Ultra games? At least, what were they planning for that 2017 slot, when Ultra Sun and Moon ultimately released? Very interesting to think about. Anyways, that's it for the scenario document. So to recap, there were multiple presentations about the game. First, we had the original pitch slide from January 2014, then came the February 2nd, 2015 slide, then the February 12th, 2015 scenario presentation, and also a gameplay presentation, pitched sometime in between all of this, which is where a lot of the stuff we touched in part 1 came from. Now, I have to preface that I only know I have a full scenario presentation. As far as the other presentations, there could be more, but I just currently don't have access to. If anyone out there somehow finds additional slides or missing pieces that I didn't cover, please don't hesitate to reach out via email. While I'm sure I covered most of the documents, if there's anything new or important, I'll make a follow-up video and I'll make sure you get producing credits. Anyways, moving on, I've gathered a number of early concept pieces, extra scrapped details, and more content to expand on from what we touched on in part 1. Starting with this, the supposed earliest pieces of concept art for Sun and Moon. These were likely drawn up sometime in early 2014, just months after the release of X and Y. We also have a concept video, created sometime later in 2014. This gives us a visual look into how Game Freak originally envisioned the game. Firstly, based on the graphics, you can tell that the models are just modified versions of the cutscene models from Generation 6. We also get a look at what seems to be the early Pokédex, before it evolved into the Rotom Dex. It definitely gives off a smartphone vibe, which is interesting, considering we didn't get a phone-style Pokédex until a few gens later. But I like that already it was a step back from X and Y's futuristic tech. The trainer is also shown carrying all 6 Pokeballs on their waist, and honestly that's some GTA 6 level immersion. I don't think we've ever actually seen trainers visibly carry all 6 of their Pokemon in-game before. Then there's this dynamic little shot of a trainer encountering a wild Rattata. Obviously this isn't how it would have looked in the actual game, But this really makes me think Game Freak wanted to have Pokemon appear directly in the overworld, a feature we didn't get until Let's Go. The battle scene also looks way more seamless and open, almost like it's happening within the overworld itself. This didn't become a thing until Legends Arceus, which makes this concept feel way ahead of its time. There's also a dynamic scene with Ursaring, which I think is meant to show off improvements in their cutscene tech. This is something that has improved in every gen since Pokemon went 3D. And finally we get this anime-style shot of a protagonist running up to a cliff, revealing a huge, sprawling city below. Obviously nothing of this scale ever made it into the final game, but it's a clear example of just how ambitious Game Freak's vision for Pokemon can get. Kinda reminds me of a BDSP concept art. Just imagine if Game Freak were able to fully realize these massive ideas. Moving on, here's a screenshot of a very early build of Sun and Moon. You can clearly see it's built on top of ORAS, especially with the UI at the bottom. The background kinda reminds me of Icky Town, but it also could just be a generic testing ground, similar to the early dev maps from X and Y. But branching off of that idea, I wouldn't be surprised if a player's house was originally located in Icky Town. Its placement in the final game always felt a bit odd, and so I've had that theory for a while. Also, the proportion work here is fascinating. It looks like a mix between ORAS's grid-based world and Sun and Moon's full-scale models. Speaking of which, there's this image of a Beta Sun protagonist next to the X and Y player model, and it really reminds you of just how big of a leap this was. It may not seem like much now, but reworking all of the world proportions and character sizes to accommodate Gen 7 style must have been a massive job for the team. Quite impressive for the 3DS era. Another early image shows the player using Pikachu's Z-move, then we see the Z-move in action. I don't recall the character model ever striking a pose like this. And here's Pikachu in battle, surrounded by a glowing Super Saiyan-like aura. At first glance, you might assume this is showcasing the totem mechanic, but I believe this is a scrapped feature from early in development, something called Aura Boost. You see, originally, Z-moves were known as Aura Boosts. When activated, a Pokemon would be engulfed in a glowing aura, granting them enhanced abilities for a limited time. And this would be the replacement for Mega Evolutions. The Z-Ring was called the Aura Brace, and the Z-Crystals were the Aura Prisms. Looking back, it seems this Aura Boost concept ended up splitting into two different ideas, Z-moves on one hand, and Totem Pokemon on the other. It makes sense. They ended up getting way more use out of it, and Z-moves didn't need all the extra jazz. If you guys remember from part 1, we covered a scrapped mechanic called Pokemon Dress Up, and now we've got a much clearer look at how that system was supposed to work. It looks like it was gonna allow for a pretty extensive amount of customization. I mean, some of the designs are wild. I wonder if it's something Game Freak still plan on adding to the games at some point. And here's some early concept art of a Pokemon Center. I would assume this would be located in the Seafolk Village. I like that the center is designed with a theme of a wooden platform. Perhaps there would have been different variations of a Pokemon Center while keeping the same general layout. And here's concept art of the Alolan Pokemon League. It's kinda funny comparing it to the final game. It has a crazy design in the concept art. There's also this concept art of a boat labeled as a shop, which is interesting. Maybe it means the Pokemon Center art wasn't located in Seafolk Village. Could this mean originally you'd be able to surf between the islands and have these lengthy water routes stocked with floating Pokemon centers, shops, and all kinds of stuff? Maybe the sea around the Alolan Islands was originally part of the explorable region. Based on this concept art, it's very plausible, and could very well be an idea that was quickly scaled back. Also in the files, evidence of two different Cosmog forms can be found. I'd assume there were originally separate Cosmog forms designed for both Solgaleo and Lunala. I wish this idea made it into the final game. Also found in the files is a scrapped Ultra Beast with a code name Mozora. What's interesting is that Mozora was also tied to a cancelled Pokemon movie. It had a moveset with Fell Stinger, Hammer Arm, Vital Throw, and Thunder Punch. Some speculate this might have been an early Buzzwole, but Buzzwole's codename is Expansion. In my opinion, I think the moveset was just a placeholder. In part 1, we talked about the highly ambitious Battle Cruise feature, a scrapped concept where you'd sail around the world, battling trainers from past games. The scale of it was insane, and since then I've found a couple more placeholder images from the original pitch that help illustrate what Game Freak was envisioning. One of these even reminded me of Blueberry Academy. We also touched on the customizable bottom screen, originally pitched as a way to celebrate the 20th anniversary. Here's a few more graphics they created for that concept. There was also a plan to distribute in-game stamps in the real-world Pokemon centers. They'd be unique to each center in the real world as well. Sounds like a pretty cool idea. I wonder how they'd pull this off on a global scale. There's also a slide from 24th July 2014 showing the original pitch of Alolan forms, but the idea was a little different. Like Pichu would evolve into Pikachu and Raichu as usual, but if a Pichu grew up in the volcanic areas of a region, it would undergo a fire-type variant of Pikachu and Raichu that you've never seen before. Personally, I prefer the final concept, but this is still a pretty cool idea. Now let's talk about one of the biggest scrapped features, a scrapped cave diving mechanic. With Gen 10 on the horizon, I believe the details here may be more relevant than ever. So unlike diving in Generation 3, it seems like you'd be able to submerge into the water with your ride Pokemon, and I assume have full control. You'd probably have a meter and a limited amount of time to explore before surfacing, let's say 10 seconds for example, and in doing so you'd be able to visit locations you previously couldn't. Assuming you'd have full 360-degree control, this sounds like a hugely technical feature for the time. An incredible idea, and no wonder why it was scrapped. Like I could imagine holding the B button to dive down and holding the A button to dive up, all while using the circle pad to control the direction. Then maybe you'd be able to upgrade your diving tech over time and have longer diving meters. The next slide even shows a gameplay mockup that matches this system perfectly. This is way ahead of its time, and if they couldn't pull it off at the time, it's something I'd love to see in Generation 10. The next slide shows how different ride Pokemon would enable unique diving moves, letting you access different locations. Honestly, the possibilities here are endless. A whole underwater sea system would completely change the game, especially in an island-based region like Alola, where there's a lot of water. I also think this reinforces the idea that you would in fact be able to surf between islands, navigating large water routes filled with content. And the fact this cave diving system got multiple slides, with breakdowns and detailed mockups, shows just how serious Game Freak were about making it happen. We briefly touched on the concept of side quests earlier, but there's actually a deeper look into how this system would have worked, through something called Rotom Quests. This feature was built directly into the Rotom decks, and it would let you view both main quests and side quests, allowing you to toggle between them. I think it's worth linking this concept to Survival Island, a scrapped feature from Part 1. After I dropped Part 1, a bunch of people in the comments pointed out how similar Survival Island felt to Yokai Watch Busters, and it got me thinking in a completely different perspective. You see, Pokemon Sun and Moon weren't just a 20th anniversary celebration, they were Game Freak's direct response to Yokai Watch. For those unfamiliar, from around 2013 to 2016, a Pokemon-like franchise called Yokai Watch underwent a cultural phenomenon in Japan, dominating Pokemon in all of the sales charts, merchandise everywhere, spawning a successful anime, with many people at the time calling it a Pokemon killer. And that's not even a hot take, it was a Pokemon killer at the time, in almost every aspect. Pokemon needed to step up, and Sun and Moon were set up to be the answer. That's what spawned concepts like Survival Island, the introduction of side quests, the massively ambitious Battle Cruise idea, and even Rainbow Rocket. You could even bring in stuff like the shift to full-size character models to one-up Yokai Watch in that regard. All of these things weren't just for celebration, Game Freak was going to war with Yokai Watch. Sure enough, Pokemon did reclaim the throne in 2016, largely due to the second coming of Pokemania, while Yokai Watch kind of faded off into obscurity. But in hindsight, that rivalry might have been the best thing to happen to Game Freak, because it forced them to get bold, creative, and even a little petty. And that push gave us one of the best generations in the series, despite all of the scrapped content. It's kind of a shame we haven't really had a direct competitor like that since. Until now. With the current trend of monster games being developed, Game Freak are gonna have more to compete with than ever. And that's a good thing. More competition means more inspiration, and more inspiration means more creativity. Pokemon is a lasting franchise, and obviously it'll stand the test of time against anything else. But a bit of competition should always be welcome, because it only means we will get a better product. And with that, we've covered all of the stuff I wanted to cover in part 2. Now listen, Sun and Moon are some of my favorite Pokemon games, but looking at all of the scrapped details, the wild pitches, the ambitious mechanics, the sheer fire Game Freak had, it gets me so excited for what's next. Back then they were held back by hardware limits, a smaller team, limited 3D experience, and a tight deadline. And regarding Generation 10, they've got capable hardware, a way bigger team than before, more experience in the 3D space, and more time to develop the project. So whenever Game Freak happens to revisit an island-themed region, I think there's a lot to be excited for. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.